So let's begin. I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and professor of political science. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar today featuring David Sanger. David is the White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, and he's a best-selling author of, among other works, The Inheritance, The Perfect Weapon, and Confront and Conceal. He's been a member of 3 teams that won the Pulitzer Prize, including the 2017 International Reporting Prize for the work on Russian interference in the U.S. elections and other kinds of disinformation. He's a regular contributor to CNN, and he also teaches national security policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And most importantly for me, he meets every year with the Stanford CSAC honor students in the face of battle class at the New York Times office in Washington, where he inspires them to go on to do great work in international security studies. The only time that he was not able to meet with us, in my memory, was on September 11th, 2001.
That's busy.
We were not able to go that day, but he's made up for it by being a real wonderful mentor to so many Stanford students, including people today who were able to talk to him before the seminar. He'll be talking today on the new Cold Wars, China's rise, Russia's invasion, and America's struggle to defend the West. I'll be speaking for 20 to 30 minutes, then we'll be in dialogue for about that same amount of time, then we'll open it up for Q&A, both from the audience here and from the online audience. So David, all yours. Please join me in welcoming David Sanger.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back at Stanford. It's great to be in this room. It's particularly good to be in this room aligned this way because I have a sharp memory, Scott. I'm not sure if you were there that day, but from one of my previous books, I came out here for a red teaming exercise while I was still writing the book. I think you were there that day. And you may recall there were 3 or 4 chapters that they just completely eviscerated, right in front of me. It was
There's
actually
a reason why they call it the murder board.
Yes, and it was actually extraordinarily helpful, but it didn't feel that great. So, but no, it's wonderful, and I want to thank Scott. He of all of the things that he named in there, he forgot the most important one, which was that when I was an undergraduate, Scott was my, I guess you were a teaching fellow at the time. And he was actually probably the most popular of the teaching fellows in the Gov department at the moment, and we've had a great friendship ever since. So it's wonderful to be here. But also the whole Stanford community was so helpful as I was working on New Cold Wars. Rose and Colin, who are here, talked me through some really hard issues, nuclear issues from Rose, the operations of the Pentagon from Colin. Secretary Rice is all over the first chapter of the book for reasons I will get into in a moment, and was kind enough to have me and my main researcher and co-writer Mary Brooks out here for reconstructing some of what happened during the Bush administration. Mike McFall and I would exchange Cold War thoughts because he's been working on a book as well, and I'm sure all of you can engage in the argument about whether we are in a new Cold War. This one is plural for a reason. I'll get to that. Or whether this is something completely different. There are some people who hate the analogy, and others who think it is truer and truer. So let me just talk for, as Scott said, 20, 25 minutes about the book and its origins and major conclusions. And then what I really look forward to is the dialogue of all of you. I'm sure everybody in this room is capable of ripping it to pieces the way the last one was, but this book's already out. So you can only help with the revised version of the epilogue. So New Cold Wars is a book about a global shock that really took Washington by surprise. And that was the revival of superpower conflict. Now, today, when you walk around Washington, because it's Washington, everybody says, oh, yeah, I saw this coming, right? But when I got back to Washington from my happy life as a foreign correspondent in Asia, I was there for 6 years, and I took up my first job in the Washington Bureau, which was 30 years ago this week, actually. Um, there was sort of a unanimity in DC about where we were in the world and how things might unfold over the next few decades. The first was we were the unipower at that moment. We were 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China was a fraction of what it is today. And here's Mike. How are you? I just talked about you, but it's too late now. So, and the result was that there was this sense that no one could rival American power. In fact, the symbol of this was that during the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, you could lift a bomber off of the runway in the Midwest, run a bombing run, and the pilots would come back and sort of go off to a barbecue. And I mean, no other country had the reach to be able to go do this. And of course, you know all of the stories about what the Chinese thought coming out of the Gulf War and what a shock that was to them. But the more important thing was that we had a sort of assumption that ran in a bipartisan way that over the next 10 or 20 years, that Russia and China, each for their own reasons, very different economies, very different societies, would find it in their interest to basically mold themselves to the Western model. Not perfectly, would never become Jeffersonian democracies. No one was arguing that. But what they did argue was that China needed American markets so much that that explained how they were beginning to create a private sector that competed with the state-run enterprises. That Russia needed to have its oil and gas flowing to Europe, and that explained why you weren't hearing very much from them about territorial ambitions. That while there were complaints, of course, about the disassembly of the old Soviet Union, there was no one who seriously thought they were going to try to take back territory because it would simply be too costly. Francis Fukuyama famously wrote The End of History, but he wasn't the only one who subscribed to that theory, that the Cold War was over, that we had won, and this was kind of a permanent victory. You saw this when you traveled with the president. And as I came back and joined the White House team, I had the chance to go do that. I was with Bill Clinton in China on many occasions when he visited. And he usually would end up with a visit to Beijing University, where he would tell the students that the internet, this new thing that had sort of come about and was taking them all by storm, was going to undercut the authority of the Communist Party of China. That it couldn't not, because people would see how other folks lived in freedom, or at least in semi-democracies, made decisions for themselves, and that therefore it would eventually erode the party's authority. In fact, at one point, he said that they couldn't control the internet because it would be like nailing Jell-O to the wall. And of course, as we all know, the Communist Party turned out to be filled with some of the world's best Jell-O nailers that have ever been invented. And those included people who managed to go take the byproducts of this great connectivity, facial recognition, cell phone tracking, the ability to use cyber tools, not only for surveillance, but also for offensive operations, and use those to, if anything, enhance the authority of authoritarians. And now, in fact, the Chinese sell this as a package. Buy your Huawei communication system, you can get a lot of the tracking systems to keep authoritarian governments in power, along with it. It's kind of like buying accessories to your car. For Russia, it was a similar story, but it unfolded in very different ways. In the Russian case, I don't think when Putin first came in, he had made a determination early on whether or not he would benefit the most by being a disruptor or being a joiner. And the first chapter of the book, first full chapter, called Floating Down the Neva River, recalls going to St. Petersburg with President Bush. Secretary Rice was along. I think she was National Security Advisor at the time. It was 2002. It was probably 9 months or so after the 9/11 attacks. And President Bush was traveling the world trying to assemble his coalition to counter terrorism. He had been to China, came to Russia. You'll remember, of course, that Putin had famously contacted him on 9/11 and said that they were standing down, nuclear alerts and so forth. And on this evening, they were floating down the Neva in a yacht right after President Bush and his wife Laura and Putin and his then wife had just seen a performance of the Nutcracker. Not any performance, but one that had been redone by a former Soviet dissident who had been invited back in to go do this. And the symbolism of that was clear. Well, they also learned the lesson that President Bush kind of prefers the old version of Nutcracker. He told me later on that he thought this one was a little weird, but that was okay. It was in the surface of, a greater purpose. And we came aboard, the press, briefly. That was at that moment that I saw in the background this sort of lurking figure. I had no idea who he was, who was serving dinner. Of course, 30 years later, when we dug up the photographs, it took a while to find something, but we finally did. It was, of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was then Putin's chef, and later on went on to run the Internet Research Agency. And so he reappears in the book during the interference in the election, and then, of course, the Wagner Group, which he denied owning, and then, of course, reveled in owning as he bailed out the Russians from many of their early mistakes. And then, of course, mounted his march on Washington, which I think is the most remarkable sort of scene in the book, which is the President Biden and his aides are gathered just outside the Situation Room, which was under renovation at the time, watching this march and sort of taking guesses about whether or not he would make it all the way to Moscow, and whether Russia would be harder to deal with or easier to deal with if run by Putin or by Prigozhin. Interesting to see that they all took different positions there. But on this float down the river, and in fact, in that whole trip, the question was, when would, not if, when would Russia join the European Union? It was, could there be a moment when Russia might join NATO? And one of the pleasures of going and doing book tour around the world, since the book's beginning to appear in some other languages, is I was in London, and their national security advisor at the time this was going on, David Manning, as he was playing the role that Scott is today, asking me hard questions, said, yes, I was sent off to go write the memorandum for the prime minister about how we would get Russia into NATO, what that might look like, what it would involve. Richard Haas told a very similar story when I was discussing the book at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. So this wasn't just some vague idea. There were people tasked to go off and figure this out, which I think tells you something about what the era was like. The result of this is that I think as we look back on it, we overemphasized every example of cooperation, and there were many good examples of cooperation, and we played down the cases in which China or Russia were going off in other directions. And when I say they really were areas of cooperation, they were real. China hosted the six-party talks, which Russia participated in an effort to try to disarm North Korea. Didn't work out terribly well. They now have 60 or more nuclear weapons, but they at least participated. I spent a year and a half of my life covering the Iran nuclear negotiations, a year and a half I will never get back. But the fact of the matter is that Russia and China were on our side of the negotiating table. And the Russians were actually pretty useful in this. This was only 2015, just 9 years ago. They took back the excess Iranian stockpiles of uranium. They were paid handsomely to do it, but they actually got the stuff out of the country. And it's pretty remarkable to think that if those talks were revived today, and I don't think we're in any danger of that happening, Russia and China would probably still be at the table, but likely on the other side. So the big question the book tries to ask is, how did we miss this? Was this an intelligence failure? Because if it was, the fact that we are fundamentally at odds again, maybe for 10 years, maybe for a generation, maybe for longer, with Russia and China, and the fact that they are coming together in so many different ways, at least their interests are converging in so many different ways, is probably one of the great misfires of American foreign policy in recent times. If it was an intelligence failure, maybe it was just wishful thinking. On the China part, I think it was prompted in part by a business community that deeply wanted to be inside the Chinese market, wanted to do manufacturing there. Think about how much of your iPhone goes through final assembly there, but hardly only the iPhone. Think about any visit you've had to Walmart. Partly, I think, it was that wonderful American capability to project on others the same motivations that we have for ourselves. So it was assumed that the profit motive would outrank Xi Jinping's interest in Taiwan, or his interest in militarizing the South China Sea, or confronting the Philippines. And through the entire Obama administration, during visits that she had to Washington, where he promised they would not militarize the South China Sea, that there would be an end to the kind of cyber activity that resulted in our losing 22 million security files through the Office of Personnel Management when that got hacked into, something I covered at length in a previous book, The Perfect Weapon. There were all of these examples where we were just looking for the moment where engagement ultimately would win out over confrontation. When did that fall apart? Well, in the Russia case, in the book, I sort of identified the turning point as the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where Putin came and declared that there were parts of Mother Russia, meaning Peter the Great's Russia, not the Russia of the Soviet era, that had to be restored. And it was such a shock to hear this sort of Cold War banter that Bob Gates, then the defense secretary and the most senior ranking American at the Munich Security Conference, stood up the next day and said, I've been through one Cold War and it was no fun, and I'm not really interested in getting involved in another. And he tried to disarm it with humor. 7 years later, of course, Putin took Crimea. It took a year for the US and its allies to put together sanctions of any meaningful type, then only after a commercial airplane had been shot down. And the next year, 2015, is when Angela Merkel signed the Nord Stream 2 agreement that routed Russian gas around Ukraine so they wouldn't get any of the benefit of the revenues from it. And she declared that Putin was a reliable supplier. Now, we'll have to wait for her memoirs, which she's busy writing, to go figure out what she meant by that. But it was an interesting phrase, because what it told you was the most important thing to her was that he was reliable and would not cut them off under any circumstance. It didn't refer back to the morality or legality of taking Crimea or the actions against Georgia or Estonia or any of the other elements. It was sort of a pure, we can do business with him kind of statement. For China, it was more complex. There were real signs of modest democratization at the town and city level in China. And when I would visit, we would go out and see these. I remember traveling with Bob Rubin there. It was only the second time a Treasury Secretary had been to China as he was trying to encourage the end of the Clinton administration, basically that China join Western standards on the way to getting them into the WTO. And it's a reminder of what a side player China was at the time, that on the way over, I said to him, gee, Mr. Secretary, with all your years at Goldman Sachs, he was there for more than a quarter century, you must have been to China a lot. And he said, no, I've actually never been, David. I said, how could that be? He said, they weren't big enough for us to pay attention to. And this was just 1995 or 1996. So by the time the Biden administration took over, the world looked dramatically different. The Trump administration, to its credit, had written a national security strategy that identified the rise of the challenge of Russia and China as the new focus of American strategy. But because the Pentagon and so many other elements of the US government had been so wrapped up in counterterrorism for so many decades, it took a while to turn the whole ship along. President Biden came in with several challenges. The first was, of course, and led to the only meeting that he had with Putin, that we were having relentless cyber and ransomware attacks from Russia. And the one that really caught his attention was Colonial Pipeline, a pipeline system that ran from Florida all the way up to New York that got turned off by Russian ransomware. And suddenly, in an era when there was plenty of gas around, there were long gas lines, and there's nothing that attracts a politician's attention faster than that. And suddenly the White House went into crisis mode and got the problem solved, got the pipelines going again after a week or two. But the fact of the matter was that the president recognized this was becoming a huge problem for American infrastructure. And that was actually what led to the meeting in Geneva, where they briefly talked about Ukraine, but spent most of the time on Putin's assurances that he was going to crack down on these ransomware groups. I needn't explain to this group of more than any how much ransomware has soared in the years since, much of it Russian-based. The second big issue, of course, were these threats we saw to Ukraine. And early in the administration, and Colin will remember this well, they had detected a big buildup on the Ukraine border, which the Russians denied was the run-up to an invasion. And later the Russian troops left, but left their equipment largely in place there. And that put everybody on alert early on. So after Afghanistan, which you'll read a chapter about in the book if you go through it, and the lessons learned there, was when the buildup began again. And October of 2021 is when the alarm bells were all going off. That led to a remarkable period and a remarkable series of decisions to declassify the information that was being put out. And that I give huge credit to the administration for, because I think it had to overcome a lot of resistance in the intelligence community to go do that. And while it didn't stop Putin from invading, it did put the allies in a position where they were ready to respond a whole lot faster to what was going on. But the degree of denial among our allies was remarkable. And the opening of the book is actually the weekend before the invasion happened, when, again, at Munich, all these European leaders and Zelensky were there denying that an invasion was coming. Putin was just bluffing, they said. And I remember the Saturday morning before the invasion, Secretary Blinken and I and some other reporters sat down for breakfast, and we were comparing notes about the leaders, the foreign leaders, foreign ministers, national leaders, who were telling us, no, it is not going to happen. And I remember Secretary Blinken, who I've known for many decades, looking at me and saying, David, I can't tell you if it's going to be 3 days from now or 3 weeks from now, but this is going to happen. And of course, it happened the following Thursday. The story of how the Biden administration handled this is told at some length, including the president's reluctance to sell advanced or place advanced weapon systems in the hands of the Ukrainians for fear of nuclear escalation. And that story you know well. I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to why he had this concern. And I don't think anybody who spent 50 years in the American foreign policy community in the nuclear age could have avoided that. There was a remarkable evening in October of 2022 when the president showed up at a fundraiser in New York at the apartment of James Murdoch, the only Democrat, I think, in the Murdoch family. And while nice New Yorkers were standing around with glasses of wine and looking at the Murdoch art collection, President Biden came in, and he looked around the room and he said, for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat to the use of a nuclear weapon if in fact things continue down the path they're going. He didn't mean like at some point in the far future. He meant in the next 2 weeks, because they had picked up signs that the Russian generals were discussing the possible deployment of tactical nuclear weapons that presumably would be used against a Ukrainian base. And he didn't discuss this series of highly classified signals intercepts, but he did say Putin is not joking. I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. I was a little shocked when I saw his comments that night, and I called somebody in the administration. I said, what is this all about? They said, oh, he gave the Armageddon speech. I said, we just got that in the Oval Office the other morning. And basically, at that moment, there were many in the administration, not everyone, who believed that under certain circumstances, there was a 50% chance that there could be nuclear use at that time. So it's understandable why the president was being careful. But I think when the history of Ukraine is written, and we can't really write it until we understand more about how the war plays out in the next year or two, one of the big questions will be, would there have been a big different outcome had we armed them sooner and more aggressively? I'm not sure there would have been. My own view is the Ukrainians weren't ready to take a lot of those weapons and know how to use them and use them effectively. But you're going to see this play out increasingly. And I think you could argue that the news of this morning, which was the administration acknowledging that we are now seeing North Korean troops in Ukraine, speaks not only to Putin's desperation, but to the North Korean recognition that they could now get the Russians to give them the kind of missile and guidance help that they have long wanted, so that they could pose a credible missile threat to the United States, because Putin wants to make it clear that if the US is going to help Ukraine reach Russian territory, he's perfectly willing to help North Korea reach American territory. I think one of the final big questions I try to grapple with in the book is the role of technology in all of this, always a central question when you're on the Stanford campus. Early in the book, you see the role of Microsoft in providing early warning of cyber attacks that were in coordination with the initial attacks on Ukraine. And it's pretty remarkable to see a private company play this role that we would expect the government to really dominate. But more importantly, we see it in the China competition and Taiwan. And when I went to Taiwan to do reporting for the book, I spent most of my time at Taiwan Semiconductor, thinking that I would learn more about the question of whether there really is a silicon shield over Taiwan from them than I would from the government. Taiwan Semiconductor is an amazing place. It's not only the most valuable company in Asia these days, but it's the one that we are dependent on for more than 90% of the advanced chips that we use for artificial intelligence, for some very advanced defense and supercomputing purposes. It's where NVIDIA makes its chips. It's where Apple makes the chips that are in your iPhone. And if somebody had come to you with a business plan 30 years ago and said, I have a great idea, let's take all of our supply chain of these chips and put it 100 miles off of China on an island the Chinese really want back sometime soon, I don't think people would have really signed up for that. But the fact of the matter is that the semiconductor story is the story of no national decisions being made, but a series of independent business decisions to cease manufacturing within 50 miles of this campus or less, and move that manufacturing, keep the design work here, and move it to one place that would be the most efficient, low-cost provider. And Taiwan Semiconductor definitely is that. There was no time I could find, as I talked to people from Intel, from other American semiconductor manufacturers, from the Commerce Department, where anybody went to the government and said, as a matter of national security, is there some limit where we shouldn't concentrate all of our supply line in this one small island? I could never find that conversation happen. And so what Biden had to go do was try to unwind that decision as quickly as he could. That's what the CHIPS and Science Act was all about. It's what the $52 billion toward semiconductor production is all about. My concern is we're not using the time terribly well. The $52 billion is a nice seed money start, and it has led to hundreds of billions of dollars in additional investment. But most of those programs from in Arizona and New Mexico, where Taiwan Semiconductor and others are building fabs, are running behind schedule. And I think the administration is unlikely to see its prediction come true of that 20% of the most advanced semiconductors would be produced in the United States by 2030. I don't think we're going to hit that number. But even if we did, being dependent on largely Taiwan for the other 80% is a huge problem. And you don't solve that with a one-time congressional investment. You solve that with lengthy and repeated investments. That's the way the Chinese do it and have done it with their Project 2025. Made in China 2025. Project 2025 is a different thing. It is something that we're not even discussing. And my guess is in this political atmosphere, you probably couldn't even get the CHIPS and Science Act through again. In fact, at one point you'll see in the book, I talked to a fairly leading Democratic senator, and we were discussing China. This is somebody who's deeply involved in China policy. And I said, if for some reason the Pentagon came to you and said, we need 10 new aircraft carriers because China is building up its Navy so quickly, do you think you'd get the money for it? Congress. He said, well, they'd be screaming and yelling and, the usual back and forth. But at the end of the day, I think you would get it. I said, if you came to Congress and you said, we need the money for 10 new fabs, semiconductor fabs, which, by the way, are slightly more expensive, each one, than what we paid for our last aircraft carrier, the Gerald R. Ford, which I think cost about $15 billion after the cost overruns. That would be a bargain for a 3 nanometer semiconductor fab. Do you think you get the money for that? He said, no, you get a lot of discussion about how this was industrial policy. And I think that's probably truer today than it was when the CHIPS and Science Act passed. And Gina Raimondo and Avril Haines tell the story in the book of what it took in terms of revelation of intelligence, of avoiding the word industrial policy to get that bill through. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to run out of gas. It already is beginning to at the end of the Biden administration. The final thought I want to leave you with is one that somebody in this audience put us onto, and that is the coming together of China and Russia in coordinated partnership, not a real alliance, and then the role of Iran and North Korea around it. And it runs all through the book. When the Biden administration first came in, I think there was no real agreement about whether or not this was for real. And it was Colin, to his credit, during an on-the-record briefing he was giving, I think by phone because it was still COVID time, to a group of us, in which he said, no, this is actually something real going on here, and you should pay attention to it. I'm not saying it's a full alliance, but I am saying this is actually, there is evidence that this is coming together in all kinds of different ways. And the next day, I hope Colin will forgive me for this, I was sitting in the Times' chair for a presidential press conference. And so I asked the president, he called on me for the last question of the day. He frequently did that because I was the only one in the press corps who was old enough to have covered him when he was in the Senate. And so he actually did recognize me vaguely. And I asked him whether he thought this competition was real. And he said, no, I really don't. I don't think these are two countries that can get along, which had been exactly what Mike Pompeo had said to me a few years before when he was Secretary of State. And the president's view changed, and changed dramatically. And by the time the administration had matured a bit on this, they were well into programs to try to keep China and Russia from making this partnership real. And at the last press conference that he gave, which may be the last one of his presidency, it was after the NATO summit this summer, he called on me again. And I asked him if there was a policy now in place of trying to interfere in this relationship, much like Kissinger and Nixon used the opening to China to try to interfere in the coming together of China and Russia. And he wandered around for a little bit, but when we brought him back to it, he said, yes, that is my policy, but I'm not going to tell you what it looks like, what the elements were, which led you to believe that at least parts of it are probably covert or interference in the way the Chinese are aiding the Russian military or whatever, but obviously there are overt elements to it as well. And that is probably going to be the biggest single problem that I think you're going to see the next president have to go deal with in these superpower encounters, of which the North Korea part was just an added element today. How many times has it come up in this presidential campaign? Precisely zero. When we have talked about China, it has been almost exclusively in terms of former President Trump's vow to do 100% or more tariffs on Chinese goods, as if tariffs were the solution to the most complex political, economic, military, and in some ways cultural challenge that we will face for the next 30 or 40 years as China emerges as a greater and greater power, with rocks along the way, as they have seen in this time. It worries me that we have not discussed this at all because I think Americans will be taken largely by surprise as this gets to be a more complex driver of big decisions. Because if in fact they are coming together, everything from our nuclear strategy to what we spend on defense to how we conduct our diplomacy around the world to whether or not we basically walk back from almost all of the major gains of globalization uh, will depend in large part on whether we are drawing a new iron curtain from this. So I'll just conclude with this line, which comes from the introduction of the book, The Shape of the New Cold Wars. If this is an era of new Cold Wars, two underway simultaneously, it is a more complex and dangerous era than we have faced in nearly a century. Almost everything about how we think about the next few decades, how we defend ourselves, how we nurture international alliances, how we spend money at a time the national debt has soared over $30 trillion, is up for contentious debate at home and around the world. In Washington, it is no longer a safe assumption the United States views its role as being the indispensable nation. A major swath of the Republican Party, which throughout the Cold War advertised itself as the defender of democracy and individual freedom around the world, has abandoned that view. And while just a few years ago it was commonplace to say we could not solve climate change or manage pandemics without the close cooperation of the world's most powerful nations, now even floods, droughts, wildfires, and new viruses cannot bring together leading nations that are undermining each other every day. When Hamas, I said, in the years after the September 11th attacks, the major powers came together in something akin to a common cause. When Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis, triggering a new crisis in the Middle East, there was no semblance of such unity. And that, I think, is going to be the defining challenge for the next president. So, Scott, with that, I will link myself to your tender mercies.
Well, we'll engage in a conversation, and then I'm going to be calling on people making a cue. Do we have a microphone to pass, Eliana, for later? Okay, then when I call on individuals in the third part of the session, if you could identify yourself, ask one question, not a series of questions. And one question does not mean giving a speech and saying, Mr. Sanger, do you agree with me? It means asking a real legitimate question. And David, this book is an unusual mixture of social science analysis, historical narrative, investigative journalism. And I wanted to start wearing a professorial hat, not an intelligence community hat, by talking about your sources and methods.
Sure.
Why do so many people talk to you? And
gee, I'd love to say it was because I was so well trained by you, Scott.
I would love it if you said that.
I would love to say it was because they found me so charming and disarming. Look, why do people talk to reporters? First, I think people have an understandable and in some ways patriotic view, if you are a government official, that you're working for the people and the role of the press is to go try to dig in and get people to understand why policy is being made. So they do that in very controlled and constrained ways. But there are people who are unhappy with the policy and they will talk to you. There are people who think that their position will be enhanced if they can win the public debate because they've just lost the private debate, and that happens. When you're doing national security reporting, we report from the outside in, which means that you start with foreign nations, foreign diplomats, ambassadors, others who have been on the receiving end of some set of conversations, Congress, congressional staffers, outside experts who've been brought in. And only then, once you've gotten an understanding of the dynamic that's underway, do you go and chat with the National Security Council or others? Because if you come in and say, explain to me why you're doing X, you get one set of answers. But if you come in and you say, it's funny, the British disagree with you on the way you're using weapons in Ukraine and have a very different policy, and they've explained their logic X way. It's a very different conversation than just asking somebody to lay out their general principle. One final thing. The Biden administration, to its credit, is full of a lot of people who have been around the block before, as was the Obama administration and as was the Bush administration. Not all of them in the Trump administration would I say that about, but some had been. And I think you'll find it pretty remarkable how many people spoke on the record for the book. Bill Burns telling the story of going to see Putin or trying to see Putin in Moscow. It turned out Putin was down in Sochi at his one of his vacation homes to warn him about the consequences of launching the war. Avril Haines on trying to explain to members of Congress why semiconductors are important. Gina Raimondo on the tactics she used to try to put together the export controls to deprive China of the most advanced chips and the equipment to go through them, and how that required diplomacy with the Netherlands and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who secretly would come see President Biden as they talked about the exports of ASML machines, which are the $100 million machines, lithography machines that sit at the middle of fabs. It's no accident that that prime minister is now running NATO. He gained Biden's trust working on the China ASML issue.
I think that's a great answer. I think you are being a bit modest, though. The other reason why people talk to you in particular is because they think you're the most likely person to get it right. Because you've
hope so.
Got a lot of knowledge and a lot of background, and that makes a difference in who you want to leak to and who you want to pass on information to. And I think that's really important.
I do think it's something that I tell young reporters, of which I no longer qualify, unfortunately, frequently, which is there's something to be said for being seen as expert or near expert in your area, because you are talked to by the policymakers with an understanding of this, a conversation between people who have been steeped in this topic for some time. And that even if they think I may not understand it as well as they do, and I usually don't, that I will understand it enough to give their position a fair hearing.
Another methods question. Can you talk about how things have changed in the New York Times in the way that you cover national security? In general, I observe all the time the change that occurred during the end of the Trump administration, where the Times and other papers, but the Times especially, has moved to say this is disinformation or someone made an inaccurate claim rather than trying to present both sides to a claim. But that same willingness to be more upfront in a position that you think is truth rather than trying to report everything objectively, that is, as if everyone is equally accurate in what they're telling you. How does that change national security reporting?
Well, first, objectivity is different than independence. Okay. And two-sidism, which is to say, giving equal claim to two sides, particularly on facts that can be reported out, is, I think, particularly dangerous. And it's President Trump, among others, but he's hardly the only one, who has forced us to this position. The problem is that doing that, getting that independent reporting on the ground, requires a huge amount of resource. And we have been extraordinarily fortunate in an industry that is largely falling apart, that particularly for local news and so forth, that as the Times has adopted a different business strategy that has brought 10.5 million digital subscriptions and far larger numbers of readers than we ever had in even the heyday of print journalism, moving away from the advertising model, we have been able to pour more and more resources into these topics. And so on the political level, when the president maintains, or the vice presidential candidate, former president and the vice presidential candidate maintain that dogs and cats were being eaten by Haitians in one town, you can put reporters into that town pretty quickly and come to some reported fact and come to those conclusions. In national security, it's harder. One thing that has helped us a lot is I rarely sit in a big investigative project meeting without our visual investigations unit, which didn't even exist 5 or 6 years ago. And this is a group of largely young reporters who are also tech wizards. Many of them came off of this campus, who manage our contracts with Maxar and with Planet Labs and others, and who have figured out how we can get photographic data from security cameras, public security cameras around the world. I'll give you an example. You may remember that at the end of the Afghan withdrawal, in all of its messiness, there was one Afghan individual who was killed in a drone strike. As he got out of his car, his kids were rushing toward the car. It killed a lot of kids as well. And the Pentagon maintained for the longest time, weeks, that this was a righteous kill, that they had determined this person was gathering the fuel to be able to do an attack on Abbey Gate or one of the other gates around at the time. And that this was the public line from the podium along the way. And this group, I had nothing to do with this story, so I can take no credit for it, but it ultimately did win a Pulitzer Prize the next year. Used a combination of satellite photographs, security camera data to prove that this was a dad who was driving around trying to get water for the kids in the neighborhood. And the drone hit him just as he was delivering the water, and the kids were running out to get the water. It was a really tragic case. But I don't think until that time, from talking to Pentagon officials I've talked to, and Colin might be able to give us some vision into this, I don't think the Pentagon had any concept that a private news organization could use a combination of satellite photographs, other kinds of data that they've put together to contradict an official American course of events. We've now used that in many cases in Gaza and Lebanon. We used it in our work on the tragedy of Bucha and what the Russians did. And we use it in nuclear cases. We've done it for North Korean sanctions evasion. And it's a remarkable set of tools. It's also a remarkably expensive set of tools. And that's what worries me the most about the state of American journalism these days, that there just aren't that many news organizations that can. We spend more on that than a lot of local newspapers have for their budgets. So.
Let me ask you a personal question. I know the answer, but not everyone here will. How did President Trump come up with the slogan, America First?
Oh, thank you for reminding everybody of this, Scott.
They may not know.
They may not.
It's trying to remind you.
It's been written about and will probably be engraved on my tombstone at some point. So in the 2016 campaign, we knew what Hillary Clinton thought about foreign policy. She'd been Secretary of State. We had covered her for years. But we knew nothing about what Donald Trump thought. And so I sent him a note and said, I'd love to sit down and do the traditional foreign policy interviews that we do on these topics. And he immediately called on my cell phone and said, come on down, let's do it. And so he went into his New York Times foreign policy interview with no notes, no aids, no preparation. And it was a remarkable conversation in which he talked about why he would pull back troops from any country that was running a major trade surplus with us. When I raised the question of whether he was okay then if Japan and South Korea made their own nuclear weapons because they would no longer be confident in the American nuclear umbrella. He thought about it for a minute. You could sort of see his mind running. It was like North Korea, bad nuclear weapons. South Korea, yeah, I had no problem with that. Japan, he had no problem with that. Lots of discussion of immigration. I realized after about an hour and a half of this that it was Friday afternoon. We had to write for the Sunday paper, and I had no overall theme for the conversation. So I said to him, sir, a lot of what you're describing, particularly in immigration, sounds a lot like the old America First movement, thinking he would say, I'm no Lindbergh, I'm, no isolations. Well, of course, it turned out, as he later said to me, he had never heard of the Lindbergh America First movement. So instead, he said, what leader would not want their country to be first? It makes perfect sense. I kind of like the sound of that. And I'm thinking to myself,
Thank you, David.
Yeah. I think he would have gotten there eventually, Scott. I don't think if it hadn't been me, it would have been somebody else. But you might argue that is a self-preservationist kind of view. So anyway, we go off, we write our story. I have a brief mention of the America First stuff deep down in the story. And that Sunday night, I think he was down in Dallas, somewhere in Texas. He was holding a big rally. And the next morning, I turn on Morning Joe or CNN, and I'm watching little excerpts from the rally. And he's standing there yelling, America first, America first. And I'm making coffee, a little stunned. And my wife comes down, and I hand her a cup of coffee, and she stares at the TV. And in that look that only a spouse can give you, he said, I hope you're really proud of yourself.
Let's turn. This will be my last question. I know. I know, Mike. You have to leave. I offered you the first question, but give. I gotta leave. Okay. I'll ask him later. Great.
Imagine the embarrassment you're saving me, Mike. Yeah.
So you use the plural Cold Wars in the title.
Yep.
And yet there's a debate going on about to what degree is what you're seeing in the China-Russia relationship closer to an alliance? That is it long partnership without limits? You have a wonderful Kurt Campbell quote saying that this is not a marriage of convenience, it's a coalition of the aggrieved.
Yep.
And yet you see in China's policy towards Ukraine limits as well as opportunities there. As you're thinking through this, how do people in Washington that you're talking to, and how do you personally think what those limits are? A Cold War against two aligned partners is tougher because they're aligned and stronger. One against two semi-aligned is more complex and more difficult. How should we be thinking about this?
And that's why in that paragraph I read, I said this is far more dangerous. So we went through a lot of debate because a lot of my academic friends, as you can imagine, said, and some still say, but fewer than when I was beginning to work on the book, that the Cold War is a wrong analogy out here. And part of the question is, when you think of Cold War, are you thinking of the one we remember from late 1945 through to the collapse of the Soviet Union? Or are you describing a set of conditions? And I was trained by the great Ernie May, who, of course, wrote a wonderful book about the use and misuse of analogy in history, and still one of my favorite volumes. And Ernie had this great method where he would take a piece of paper, put a line down the middle, and when you're getting ready to go use an analogy, write the similarities down on one side, write the differences on the other. And it seems simplistic, but frequently good for clarifying thought. One big difference is that the old Cold War had only one competition to it, the US-Soviet one. And within that, it was largely a military conflict. And within that, it was largely a nuclear conflict. And there was a predictability to it. It had its terrifying moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis and others. But over time, we came to believe that we could predict how they would react and they could predict how we would react. And we thought we had it down to, if not a science, at least a management case. We were not dependent on the Soviet Union for anything. Well, it's not true. Caviar and vodka, for sure. Two things that you and I would never want to give up. But if we had to live without it, we could probably get by. Okay. This one has got, as you point out, three players with some side actors, a group of countries that, as one chapter in here is entitled, are saying to us constantly, don't make us choose between these two sides. And I would argue when it comes to the technology issues, you really have to choose. And the dynamic of having three is so much more volatile. The chances of miscalculation are so much higher. And you just see it in the nuclear case. Rose can talk about this later on, because we have China's decision to essentially build its nuclear arsenal to roughly the size of the American and the Russian arsenal before they get involved in any kind of conversation, and they may never get involved in a real conversation on arms control or the use of artificial intelligence in decision making, for military decision making, a topic of which you'll see an executive order tomorrow from the president on AI and its use in national security. This becomes much more volatile, much harder to judge. And meanwhile, we are depriving the Chinese and the Russians, for different reasons, of key technologies that we think advance their capabilities in AI, in chip making, in being able to rebuild their military. And the Chinese, at least, view this as a modern form of containment. So to some degree, even if it doesn't match up particularly with the last Cold War, that doesn't mean it isn't of a new and different form.
Leanna, if you could get the microphone, and I'm going to take a list of people, and I want to see some hands who'd like to ask. So let me turn to Rose Mueller. And if you could introduce yourself, whether I know you or David know you, matters less than the audience, so they know who you are, et cetera.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm Rose Mueller. I'm the William J. Perry Fellow here at CSAC, and this sounds like a wonderful book, David. I haven't read it yet, but I promise you I will. Quick question. I agree with you absolutely that the Munich Security Conference in 2007 was a key moment. But, you know, I was living in Moscow then as director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, and it was also the year that Dmitry Medvedev became president, and Putin set aside the presidency in what at least some said was this great moment when he recognized the necessity of abiding by the Russian Constitution. Now we all recognize this was a period of exuberance, thinking that we could be on the cusp of new reforms in Russia and that Medvedev was going to represent this great figure, but it lasted a while because he and Obama worked very well together, et cetera, et cetera. How do you account for the fact that we had Putin, you know, pouring cold water in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, and then we end up with this new period of exuberance over democratic reform in Russia?
Remember, I said briefly at one point, Rose, an excellent question, that we would overemphasize the importance of everything that looked like democratic reform, and setting aside, you know, observing term limits is like the core of, you know, constitutionalism. And it took a little while before the Obama administration realized that Medvedev couldn't really make very many decisions along the way. He was charming at that time. He's become this sort of wild hawk in recent times. And so we may have misjudged him. I remember sitting down with him at one point on a visit that he made to Washington, and he said, you know, there are parts of Russia where we can see Alaska. So got a really good laugh out of everybody. So he knew how to play the crowds really well. But I think it was Putin's period of time. He knew he was coming back, and it was just the question of how he was going to consolidate the power. If there was another moment other than 2007, I would say it was when Hillary Clinton publicly criticized the parliamentary election as fixed, and Putin went ballistic on this topic. And to this day, I think as you trace this back, it helps explain why he was so willing to go interfere in the 2016 election and come up with everything they could that was embarrassing to Clinton. I'm not sure it affected the outcome at the end of the day. I know there are people in the intelligence community who strongly believe it did. I have not, you'd have to crawl inside the brains of 77,000 voters in Wisconsin and Minnesota and other places to figure out whether it changed their votes. But I think that was a big turning point as well.
See Margarita here, if you pass it back.
Thank you. I'm Margarita Sheshelgita. I'm visiting fellow here in CSAC, and I come from Lithuania. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, but also for a very grim scenario, what's waiting for us in the future. And I suppose in this future, the role of small states might be diminished, because when there is less of rule of law internationally and more right of the might, small states do not have much to say. And there is an election happening in Lithuania at this time, and we're joking that we are probably more interested not in what's happening in Lithuania, but what's happening in the United States.
Sure.
It's for our security, the US leadership in Europe, in the world, is key. And we are very anxious what's going to happen here. So I would like you to ask you to elaborate a bit about two scenarios, most probable and most dangerous of the US leadership in managing new Cold War. Thank you.
Great question. It's pretty remarkable to think that we are now 13 days out from an election, which will change our perception of which way the US is going on this. Even if it is decided by only a few thousand votes or a few tens of thousands of votes, who knows what it will be. And I guess my hope is that if whatever the outcome is, it is decisive in either direction, because I can't think of anything more dangerous for the US than to spend the next 4 months arguing over who should be president and who actually won. But it will answer the question maybe of whether the Trump administration looks like the blip in an essentially internationalist series of administrations to which Trump came in and pulled the plug on much of that, or whether the Biden administration looks like the last gasp of that era. And a lot of that's going to depend on the symbolism of what happens in Ukraine. You could imagine, as President Trump has said, that he will solve the problem in 24 hours. But the only way I know how to solve the problem in 24 hours is to call Putin up and say, so what do you really need? And he says, well, I'd settle right now for 20% of the country, the 20% I'm already in. And then there's a call made to Zelensky to say, do we ever have a deal for you? You can continue to get your aid if you just give up 20% of your country, right? And no one's going to be watching that more carefully than the Chinese, right? Because they're going to think, what does this tell you about our willingness to step in the Taiwan case and elsewhere? And ultimately, to Putin's calculation about whether or not he could take back a small NATO country and also, in the end, cut a deal. It's interesting when President Trump talks about this, former President Trump talks about this, he talks about it as if there's a deal to be made there rather than there's an issue of sovereignty to be debated. On Vice President Harris's side, we have heard we will stand with the Ukrainians, but what you also hear is chances are we're not going to get the kind of packages that we have seen through Congress again, even if Vice President Harris is elected president. particularly if she lost the House and Senate along the way. In which case, there may end up being a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine might lose 20% of the country, but at least it would be a settlement in which the Ukrainians themselves were involved in making the decision. And that's a huge difference.
Berlin.
Lynn, CSAC, and Hoover, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you see the most likely fault lines between Russia and China to be worked at and expanded, whether we're doing it covertly or overtly.
Great question. So after the October 2022 nuclear incident, the first thing the administration did was go to the Chinese and the Indians and get them to try to issue statements that basically said there's no role for nuclear weapons in the Ukraine case. And that was a good wedge issue. And I think at the beginning of the war and for the first year and a half, the Chinese didn't want the Russians to lose, but they weren't particularly interested in the outcome. I think now they're much more interested in the outcome than they were before. And I think they have sort of signed on with the Russians in a way that I would not have said a year or a year and a half ago. I would be happy to be argued with on this point. But I think all the evidence of the way they're acting, what they're shipping, and so forth suggests they view it as important that the Russians at least hold their ground. And I don't think we saw that before. I think this North Korea deployment could be a really important wedge issue if the administration plays it right, and they don't have very much time to play it at all right now, because the Chinese can't be very happy about the degree to which the North Koreans have signed on with Putin, are sending him troops, creating some instability that the Chinese may not be able to go handle along the way. They like the North Koreans dependent on them. And so the fact that they've suddenly developed the first real leverage they've ever had. I mean, when in our lifetimes, and people in this room, have the North Koreans ever been sought out by a significant power for anything, right? But the Russians needed ammunition, and now they need soldiers. I think that could be a wedge issue along the way. But to do that, you have to have a real conversation underway with the Chinese. The last face-to-face meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping was down the road here just about a year ago. It was Thanksgiving time. They've talked a few times on the phone, not terribly productively since. So you can't really create these wedges very effectively, I think, if there isn't at least some discussion of that management.
Follow on from Colin Cowell.
Yeah, just a quick thing.
Colin, wait for the microphone, and then Susanna, you're next.
Just a quick reaction to see if this tracks with
The people watching, say who you are, Carl.
Sorry, Colin Call. I'm a senior fellow here at CSAC. So it's interesting. Robert O'Brien's article that outlined Trump's foreign policy were he to be reelected mentions this kind of axis of upheaval, but lists it as China, Russia, and Iran. When Jake Sullivan talks about it, he talks about Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And it's an interesting, I think, window into how different administrations might see the wedge that you just mentioned.
I think,
in other words, for Trump, it's about playing Kim Jong-un and reimagining their bromance. And potentially for Harris, it's about trying to drive the wedge through Beijing.
So the only thing I would say to that is the bromance worked out really well. So we're at 60, some people think 100 nuclear weapons, but somewhere in that range out there. The North Koreans have enshrined in their constitution the nuclear weapons program at this point. I think the hardest North Korea problem facing the next president is going to be whether to just drop the ritual American statement that our ultimate goal here is, verifiable. One more. It's not happening with North Korea any more than it's going to happen with Pakistan, India, or Israel. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not we sort of adjust ourselves to a policy that sort of deals with that question. My favorite point of the Trump I've been honored to Bill Trump. They might want to do mine.
You can introduce yourself, please.
Zuzana Čapuzová, former president of the Slovak Republic. Slovakia is direct neighbor of Ukraine and also member of NATO. And I would like to ask you maybe it's a similar question than my colleagues from Lithuania, but a little bit specific. How do you see the perspective of NATO, especially the role of the US, if Donald Trump win presidential election?
The new Secretary General of NATO is going to have his hands full because I do think it's very possible in the second term that President Trump could actually pull out of NATO, or at least declare that he is not going to go along with NATO policies. And without the United States as the linchpin there, I don't know how you make NATO work. It has been interesting to see in the past few months how they've been trying to move NATO to Trump-proof this. But the core of NATO is the confidence that the United States and this nuclear umbrella would cover NATO members. And if you lose that confidence, whatever the structure is around it, I think becomes less important than the belief of the NATO members that the United States had. They've done sabotage, but they've done some sabotage for hire too. A lot of cyber fire. But they haven't, for example, bombed the shipment of missiles coming into Ukraine while it was on the NATO side of the border. And I think that tells you that Putin is quite concerned about getting into things with NATO. And we have to preserve and enhance that. And that's really what's at the core of the question of Ukraine's NATO membership. And, it's been the Biden view that that's waving the red flag in front of Putin. And he and Chancellor Scholz have been the ones who have led the opposition to making a firm commitment. The other way to look at it is Putin doesn't want to get into a conflict with NATO. And so maybe, the moment's got to come. And that's the core of the debate.
Catherine.
I'm Catherine Stoner. I'm a senior fellow here as well, and the director of the sister center to CSAC downstairs, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. And I also wrote a book on called Russia Resurrected on Russian power and it came out in 2021. So I would largely agree with you about the underestimation or overestimation, I suppose, or overemphasis on the sort of positive things that we saw between 2008 and 12 with Medvedev. I would also say that Russia had its own domestic politics, right, which clearly drove some of the decisions Putin makes. So, in 2012, we get the Foreign Agents Act and we get successive crackdowns. So I think there is a big connection between the sort of re-audit or deepening of the autocracy and foreign policy choices that are made thereafter. So I guess I would make the turning point not 2007 so much as after that.
I would agree. I think that domestic policy, and that's right around the time that Clinton criticized them, and that
She did it 2011 in the fall over the Duma elections. But so, but one thing I wanted to ask you was this metaphor of the Cold War. I've been struggling with, and I know Michael McFall has struggled with it too, of course. And I just wonder, one of the things that there are lots of differences between then and now. But one of the biggest is the ideological component, right? So that really was an existential struggle about the best way to organize a society, right, between communism and capitalism. And this is not. Russia, for example, does not present an alternative, especially does not present an exportable alternative, which is a great example of how to run your life, right, to other countries. So I just want to know basically what you think the ideological component is, and what the sort of, other than territory, what's the fundamental issue here?
First of all, I agree with you, and there is not an exportable model that's come out of this. The Chinese view it a little bit differently. They do think they have an exportable model, but it's a model of authoritarianism backed by selling you, as I suggested in the talk, a range of technologies that will bolster authoritarians. There's a reason that Hungary loves using Chinese technology, along the way, and so do many other, authoritarian states. And if you follow the technology rather than the ideological writings, you sort of get to see where the new digital Iron Curtain, and to some degree the physical one, gets put together. And so the Chinese are definitely trying to export an authoritarian model. The Russians don't export much other than oil, and that's been, yeah, but not, that's right. And some things that we buy, but they're not doing it with the kind of business plan that I would say the Chinese have put together of how you mix authoritarian control with the networks that you are shipping around the world. And look, that's the core of the TikTok argument, right? Now, maybe that argument is over, because by the time the United States engaged the possibilities of what TikTok could do, it was on the phones of 170 million Americans. And as Gina Raimondo says in the book, yes, you could strip TikTok off of their phones, but it would be an act of political suicide. And she's right. But TikTok's an amazing example, because we always thought of the Chinese as copying American technology. Here is a Chinese-made technology that proved completely addictive to half the American population and seems on its face to have no political agenda, but easily can be turned to one. And it's why the Trump administration wanted to bring control of TikTok back in the United States before President Trump reversed his decision. He thought it would be good for Microsoft, and suddenly, if that was going to happen, it's why the Biden administration actually agreed with Trump on this and then couldn't manage to do anything about it.
I have Alan Weiner next on the list. If you could pass it back to.
Here's Alan. Oh, I saw you back there.
I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. David, good to see you again. Intrigued so much by the argument, including the fact that we tended to overestimate signs of rapprochement, engagement, normalization, becoming a status quo power rather than revisionist power for these countries. But what about our failure to underestimate the extent to which our own conduct in the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I'm focused on Russia more than China, which I don't know as well and has, I think, a more domestic story. To what extent did NATO enlargement, to what extent did the invasion of Iraq in violation of international law, disregard of the Council, the use of force in Kosovo, which we're still hearing about, right, from the Russians, to what extent did our, and this is a question, because I know people have different views on
And the
this,
use of American weapons.
but to what extent did our hubris, if you will, after winning the Cold War, is that the right date to look for the start of this period rather than 2007 or 2011?
I just add here that Marcos Kounalakis from the Hoover Institution also adds Libya to that list of things that the Russians often say. And the question is, what do American officials think of this argument, since the Russians make it so often? And what do you think of it as a motive in Russia?
So in the early days of NATO expansion, this was debated in Washington. And of course, Kennan famously wrote a New York Times op-ed in which he argued against the NATO enlargement and so forth. My own view after, my travels to some of these countries and reporting out the book, once NATO created a set of entry requirements, what were they going to do once a country freely came to the conclusion that they really wanted to switch sides? Say, no, you can't? Now, so I think the enlargement had to happen. But I agree with you that our behavior along the way, our celebration of that moment, the talk of the unipower, the expression of force, God, a lot about there, and certainly given action in Lebanon too, where for all kinds of complicated historical reasons, we are not coming back and talking much about the sovereignty issues for Lebanon, which, while dominated by Hezbollah, does have a real government to it. So I think all these contributed. I'm not sure, had we not done it, it would have turned out any differently. And, it's one of those things in history we will never know the answer to. But I think sooner or later, Xi and Putin were going to come out where they came out.
With apologies to a number of people who have their hands up, and I apologize, we are at the end of our session. Before I invite you to a hors d'oeuvre and wine and soft drinks and an opportunity to buy David's book and get signed, I want to say that this is a beautifully written book. And one of my favorite analogies is not the numerous analogies to Cold War events, although I like much of that. It's the conclusions where you say, this is terra nova, akin to what faced European map makers in the 17th century who resorted to drawing pictures of familiar animals in the interior of the New World because they didn't know what was there, but couldn't admit it. And I think that we as scholars and as journalists have to be really careful not to do that. We like to use our understandings of history and make these comparisons. And I think much of what you're reminding us of is that we need to have more imagination and to think through these things because we are in a new world and we're not sure what's coming up. But thank you for helping illuminate this.
Well, thank you. I'm a little bit of an amateur map collector, and I keep a couple of those maps hanging up in my home office. And I would stare up at them every once in a while and wonder why they were filling the space, which explains that paragraph.
Well, I invite you to get this book, and David, I'd like you to sign my copy of it. And if you do, I will finally clear the incomplete that you got in your junior year.
Thank God.
So, Thank you very much.